Hi everyone, and welcome back to this virtual edition of Capacity Asia. You've joined the Digital Infra Leaders Asia track with this panel on green shoots, creating the framework for greenfield infrastructure builds and investment in APAC. Before we get started, I would just like to say thank you to all of our sponsors who are making this event possible, particularly our platinum sponsors, China Mobile International, China Telecom Global, China Unicom Global, Globe Telecom, and PCCW Global, as well as our gold sponsors, Equinix and Telstra. Do stop by their booths later on to say hello. So here is our fantastic lineup of speakers for the session. Please do make sure that you submit questions to the panel using the live chat function on Swapcard throughout the session, and we'll try and get to those towards the end. So I'd like to hand over to the session's moderator, Ubaid Buanas, who's managing partner manager for APAC Network Investments of Emerging Markets at Facebook. Ubaid, over to you. You're muted, Ubaid.
Hi, thank you very much, Liz. Welcome to all the panelists. Thank you for joining this interesting discussion. I think in the next hour or so, we'll try to understand the key barriers to connect the next billion people in Asia, and what are some of the frameworks that are currently working, and how we can actually expedite the deployment of infrastructure in these countries. Just to open up the discussion, it's a consensus world over that the next billion internet user, Asia's contribution would be significant. Currently, there is half of the Asian population currently is not on internet, and Asia with large population size and growing economies will contribute major, like 80% of the next billion connected people. I'll start off the discussion with kind of understanding the key barriers to the connectivity for the next billion users, and what is the time frame also we are looking at that these populace will come into the internet domain. So I'll start off with Robert. What do you think are the key barriers to connectivity, especially when it comes to Asia region? And what is the time frame we are looking at that this population will come or should come on the internet? Over to you.
Well, sure, and thank you. I start off at the foundational level, and as we've discussed previously, sort of the regulatory market is really where you have to start. When you take a look at the hyper-connected markets, the Japan, the Koreas, the Hong Kongs, the Singapores, versus the tier 2 markets like in Indonesia, possibly a Thailand and some others, there's a fundamental difference as to how they treat regulation. In those hyper-connected markets, you have really an open framework and really a two-tier framework where you'll have the tier 1, type 1 facilities-based operators that dig up the streets, that put in the infrastructure, and then you'll have the permissible level of service-based operators. These are your SBOs, your internet service providers, your people that don't need to dig up roads but want to operate equipment in a given jurisdiction. The locations, those tier 2, where that next new billion reside, they don't have that structure. There's really one flat, usually very regulated environment, and there isn't that bifurcation, there isn't that split that allows new, smaller, more creative entrances into the market by either foreign investors or even locals that may not be well capitalized and have 100 million to spend, but only have $1 million to spend on a given endeavor. So to me, the table stakes, the starting point is for the governments in these locations to recognize that a more open framework, a more viable framework would be something to mirror how Singapore, Hong Kong, and the others have approached it and allowed sort of the dynamic model for not only local, but foreign investment into the market. So back to you. Thank you.
Audrey, do you agree with Robert's take on that the regulation is the key barrier? And if it's so, what are the other barriers that are preventing this connectivity in the Asian region?
Yeah, I do agree with what Robert just mentioned. It's kind of like a spin-off of what he just spoke about. To me, I think cost is one of the considerations in hampering for this progress. Now, if you are to break this into two segments, the international connectivity part of it as well as the domestic, from a more international connectivity space, the more developed metros in the region, the most compared to them, most other markets have limited connectivity to the rest of the world, with them slightly behind on this curve. And there are so many reasons to why this is such, because every market is unique. But some of these include telecommunication policies, like what Robert mentioned, which could be more restrictive, and therefore resulting in a closed market with a smaller but dominant number of players. The lack of capital funds, foreign investments, does not allow them to build or develop submarine cable and terrestrial systems to enable connectivity. So all that is lacking. So naturally, with limited availability, the lack of competitiveness, the situation makes it hard for the math to add up, whether you're an eyeball looking to get out of the country to connect with your partners or upstreams, or you're a content or service provider looking to expand your network into that new market to service your end users at scale. And then domestically in country, as our discussion topic today suggests, the next billion people across the region sit in these rural areas. And these may not necessarily be your high ARPU consumers. But that said, also sitting in these regions could be specific industrial or enterprise use cases like agriculture or mining. But these are very, very niche demands, and ultimately are reliant on availability of newer, more efficient or effective technology like 5G to deliver. So more often than not, it's a situation where an independent provider or operator finds it challenging to put together a sensible business case to extend that fiber connectivity to such area. So it's really a chicken and egg situation, where on one hand, if infrastructure is prohibitive, it's less able to support any possible pent-up demand. And conversely, seemingly small demand does not justify for further capacity investments.
Adrian, your take on the barriers, and I would also like you to kind of also put into perspective the time frame on which we are looking at these. There will be a need to connect these people and the internet.
Yeah, thanks, Ubaid. So I firstly agree with what Robert and Audrey have both outlined. Another key barrier for me is the physical barrier of being able to get access to the infrastructure, as Audrey's indicated, in the rural spaces in particular. If I use Australia as an example, historically getting landline connectivity, voice connectivity, payphone connectivity to rural areas has typically been subsidized by governments or by the industry itself in the form of a universal service obligation. In Australia's case, and that methodology continues. So for me, I guess a mitigant or a way to overcome this is depends on, I guess, and this answers your secondary question around timelines in a way, how progressive the government of the country that we're talking about is in their thinking in terms of how they want to expand infrastructure into the rural areas, and obviously how quickly that will happen will be dependent on how quickly and how much money they need or want to spend in that space.
So taking on from there, Adrian, what are the possible solutions? Are there any particular models that have worked well in certain countries that can be stretched and expanded to other emerging economies? Is it private sector the only responsible to lead that infrastructure spree, or are there any other innovative models?
Yeah, look, I think where competition exists, or where private companies can make I guess a return on their invested capital, that will happen organically. Again, speed is the question there, because everybody's going to go after the more densely populated areas before they go after the less densely populated areas. But if there is competition there, if there is a demand profile there, private companies will go after that, and so they will serve those communities. Where there is, I guess, another scenario might be where there might be a sole, I guess, operator who can make a return. Maybe they've got some niche assets in a particular area. Maybe they've got some unique investments in a particular area. Maybe they've got a unique link to the community, and so as a result, they're better placed than anyone else to kind of invest and make a return. And obviously within infrastructure investments, you're talking about a long, I guess, return on investment there. And the third, I guess, way of operating would be, I guess, a fully kind of public approach where a government will go and fund it solely, or I guess a hybrid approach where you see public-private partnership. And so, I guess, again, it depends on, the country that you're talking about, but I've seen public-private, consortiums, if you like, operating well. We see it working well in infrastructure investments like building roads and building tunnels and building bridges and whatnot. So that can absolutely work in the telecommunication infrastructure environment as well.
Thanks, Adrian. Audrey, you did mention this rural fiber not being lucrative enough for private players because the feasibility of servicing the low ARPU customer, building higher cost infrastructure doesn't make sense from the business perspective. I just want to check whether that hypothesis stands true even after the pandemic, or after the pandemic, the need for data and need for rural data has increased and it has changed the economics slightly. Or do you think that pandemic has absolutely no effect on that business dynamics and that still remains unfeasible to connect the rural population purely from the business standpoint?
So it really depends on how far remote you define rural to be. Does suburban also fall under the rural definition? So in our business, we have seen continued strong interconnectivity growth even during this period, which may or may not be a result of the pandemic. As it is more common sight for us now to be working from home, working from anywhere, the demand for increased connectivity from the urban as well as suburban areas are evident. At the same time, we see the accelerated need for businesses to transform the traditional lines of business to reduce costs, more efficient, transform the network architecture. However, pandemic or not, I think the business case for rural fiber really still boils down to supply and demand and the availability of cost-effective technology to enable the reach to these outlying communities. It could be due to distance or simply inaccessible terrains. So my view is I don't think it has really made any significant change to the business case for that need.
So Robert, just to carry forward the discussion that we are looking at some other frameworks which are currently implemented and how can those frameworks make it possible. You touched upon the regulatory barrier and the policy barrier to begin with. What are the frameworks we should look into especially in the emerging markets, or what are the inspirations they can draw from while looking at their own regulatory and policy regime? Is it the capacity issue at the regulators and that they don't understand the open policy narrative, or they are trying to de-risk some of their own challenges by putting in place these regulatory barriers into communication infrastructure?
Well, I think it's a rather complex conversation that varies market by market. Now, in the emerging markets, I think one of the challenges that artificially happens is that the telcos see that there's the opportunity to get public funding because the regulators keep talking about it. There's an incentive for them to stretch and push into rural markets. So even if you had a telco, a fiber provider, a wireless provider that saw a positive business case to build into a certain area, they may not go ahead and do it because they would rather negotiate back with the government, secure additional funds to make that business case even sweeter for them. I know I'm being the cynic of the bunch, but at the end of the day, these are normally profit-driven companies, and if they see the opportunity to derive profit, for lack of a better term, from a different source, from the public source, they're going to make use of that. So I think we've almost become our own worst enemy in some of these areas where in some of the developed countries, that's what's occurred. And in the US and throughout Europe, where you've seen some of those rural builds, that may not have required public funding, because it was talked about and it became available, it was used. So that's sort of become the de facto model that everyone wants to go after. If not de jure, it's become the default that people sort of lay into and want to go with. So I do think that's going to become more and more of a model that you see, merely because it tends to work, and it tends to give the politicians, the regulators, a lever to pull to help trigger certain things. And yes, maybe there's an election coming up and they can trigger a build in an area where they are getting votes from. Again, the cynic in me sees that as something that is just part of the world that we live in, regardless of what the demand set is. I did want to throw out one other thing that I've seen actually work in some developing markets for infrastructure that didn't require public funds directly. And that's areas where, and we saw this in Mexico and the Philippines, where actual tax-free or tax open zones were created in certain areas where there was no infrastructure, no power, no fiber, nothing. But because foreign companies could go into these haven opportunities, big manufacturing facilities would build huge plants in these tax havens, and that would force, or that would become a source of gravity to actually drag power companies, telecommunication companies into a given region. So this isn't an area where the government was actually providing money directly to someone, but it was indirectly foregoing a tax revenue base to entice a build out of infrastructure almost secondarily or by default. So I'm just throwing that out as a model that we could very well see in some of these developing markets, in the Vietnams, continuing in the Philippines, possibly the Indonesias. That may be a good way to spark growth in an area indirectly, if not directly.
This is very interesting suggestion. So, Adrian, would you like to add, like, if there are, like, if we need to highlight 3 to 4 major issues with the regulatory environment of the telecom policies in emerging markets in Asia, what are the key things that you want to change? And now Robert touched upon a very interesting thing, that the government pool of money, or the development money, or the universal service fund, because of availability of it and because people are talking about it, at times private players kind of wait for that fund to be unlocked, so it kind of becomes more of a problem than the solution itself in certain cases. Do you agree with the Preet? And
yeah, I tend to agree. And the case in point that I would use to showcase that is what happens in the US. I mean, I use the Australian example, you know, of the Universal Service Fund, and that's been expanded, you know, to cover broadband. And obviously now the government is rolling out this NBN infrastructure in Australia. But the other example I would use is in the US, where they had a 4G mobility fund set up to I guess fund the deployment of 4G LTE infrastructure in rural America. And now they've just recently, I think it was at the end of October, the US government, the FCC, has signed off another 8 to 9 billion US dollars to deploy 5G eventually into rural US. So I agree with Robert. And so what that does is that you know, kind of signals that continuity, if you like, signals that, you know, this is what's going to happen in rural, you know, in rural areas in some countries, and therefore, you know, businesses will wait for the handout before those areas get the funding. And what that then in turn does, the knock-on impact, if you like, is that those rural areas don't get access to the connectivity quickly, right? They get it eventually, right? But you know, if I use the example of 4G to 5G and the two funds that I just referenced in the US, I don't know this categorically, but I could hang a hat on the fact that they've probably just finished rolling out 4G LTE and finished kind of exhausting the fund on that side of things, and you know, now they're going to be turning their attention to the 5G side of things. So yeah, so that's kind of the way that I tend to look at that.
So in terms of regulatory change, Andre, do you think the governments, or especially in emerging markets, should kind of make it like open access in the rural areas, like should allow all kind of sharing, including the spectrum and the licensing, so that community driven or any private player in certain areas can come up with a service. Wouldn't it create like of a regulatory mess for the regulators?
It would definitely help. Having the regulatory support and open initiative would certainly help drive a lot more activity in that space. It would allow more people to band together for a common goal, common desire, to come up with a partnership model to develop that connectivity that we need. So even for our business, we never believe that one single party can truly own that end-to-end supply chain or develop that solution for connectivity. Every of us as businesses, we have our own specialization, core expertise, if you will, and it's about us coming together, to enable more flexible solutions through partnerships. So the situation in rural communities or any community at all is really as such. The eyeballs desire the content and accessibility, and vice versa. The content and cloud providers have that ambition to improve latency and performance for end users. So the idea is almost like forming a consortium of sorts, everyone with vested interest to make this whole thing work. The actual partnership model, the levels, types of contribution will certainly vary depending on the market conditions. And contributions could come by form of technology development, investments, financial contribution, or even manufacturing supply. So I'm not sure if this is going to necessarily deliver better connectivity, but having all these stakeholders in this connectivity supply chain, even with the regulators, come together to jointly deliver that solution is one of the possible ways forward.
Robert, what are the other partnership models? Who are we only looking at from the existing mobile network operators and connectivity players within geographic location as the stakeholders? Are there other stakeholders like utility companies, maybe road and transport network, oil rigs that generally work in the remote regions? Are there other businesses that can be part of this development, and they can kind of put their skin in the game in terms of developing this infrastructure? Or we
well, they certainly. Oh, sorry. Well, we certainly can make use of a lot of those additional layers, merely because when you're dealing, especially in rural communities, it's that last mile that's the most expensive part. And the right of way to get into these communities is very expensive. Now, in some of these communities, in some of these areas, there may be pipelines. It may be an oil-rich or a utility-rich area, or there may be power, or there may be some other type of natural resource that's there. So depending on the market we're talking about, depending on the community, there may be some type of infrastructure. So really, you're not meaning to go back to the regulator or the government, but they're the ones that really have that holistic view to determine what makes sense for this community, because the answer may be different depending on what part of the country that you're in. And you're really not dealing with, like in the Western world, you saw an evolution from a copper-based infrastructure to fiber with wireless added on. The markets that we're really addressing, we're really talking about, don't have that. In most cases, there isn't copper in the ground. If someone put copper in the ground, someone came right behind them and dug it back up because it was copper, it was worth money. So it wasn't something that you had as an availability. We're leapfrogging technologies in many ways. So there might be the right answer for some of these communities, may be working with a utility to get the long haul, the right of way there, and then a wireless provider to provide that last mile. Some of the sticky points that we get to is a lot of the main content players and a lot of the main online and OTT space players that we talk about are really looking to deliver content over that access, but they're really not looking to become a telco in that rural market. They're not willing to be looked at as a telecommunications provider in Vietnam, let's say, but they want to be able to deliver their content there. So there's sort of this middle person that needs to be putting in the investment, needs to be building out the infrastructure, and needs to be doing it hopefully profitably to be able to provide that last bit, to be able to connect this last billion that we're trying to get to. Back to you.
So I think that's again an interesting point that you raise, and there are a couple of models that have kicked in. One is purely government funded model where government takes up the initiative of connecting all the smaller union councils or like administrative units with the fiber or national grid fiber. But then that stops there. It doesn't kind of initiates a lot more development around the last mile access technology, because then when the government builds it, they also want to control it, and then obviously the pricing mechanism becomes slightly slower. The, that's one model. The other model where the private sectors, the telco players have kind of gotten together to kind of do a shared model. But at times the competitors don't trust each other very much when it comes to reaching out to the new areas. Is there a midway between this? And the question is open to all the panelists. Audrey, would you like to address this one first?
My take on this, and I just will make a disclaimer that regulation and policies is really not my area of expertise. But I'd like to say that we oftentimes don't know what we don't know. So education is kind of key to enabling a better connected world in general. It's not necessarily about the last mile infrastructure, and it's not something that will happen overnight or change either. But the continued community effort in education will ultimately enable a better understanding and appreciation of what things could be. In less developed markets, you don't need to go through the stumble blocks that the more developed markets have gone through. We know that we can accelerate change and actually become better by learning from the experience of others. So it's the various players in their respective ecosystems, be it the submarine connectivity community, the internet peering community, with policymakers coming together to exchange knowledge, best practices, putting more heads together to solve a wider problem.
You're on mute.
You're on mute, sorry.
Adrian, what's your take on this particular thing, the partnerships, and what is the middle way?
I don't know whether there's just a simple answer to this. I don't know whether there's a middle way. I mean, earlier I talked about the kind of 3 or 4 models that I saw kind of operating in terms of infrastructure deployment. What I didn't talk about is the model whereby talk about is what I didn't talk about was the model that saw us operating. Sorry, there's a lot of feedback on this for some reason. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. We just lost you in the middle.
Okay, so what I didn't talk about is the model by which the government would run out the network themselves, and at some point in time hand over the operating of that network to a network operator. Where the capital investment has been I guess absorbed by the government, and the telecommunications provider that takes on the OpEx kind of cost of running the network. And so that's a model that could work. Again, it's all very scenario based. And it's obviously based on what the demand profile is, looks like in that particular area. One of the things that you did ask earlier, is has the pandemic changed, or will the pandemic change, the way that that rural communities, if you like, will kind of create demand, and I think it will. I see. In the various countries that that I've lived in, and still kind of speak to people in those countries, I've seen a kind of a shift in mindset, at least due to the fact that people have successfully worked from home and worked remotely for a long period of time, a long sustained period of time. It's almost like we've proven it to ourselves that we can do this. And while there will be I guess a move or a migration back into the office once we are able to get back into the office, I do think that people are going to take advantage of, being able to live outside a city, being able to live in a rural environment, and as a result, you're going to see, hopefully, more and more kind of skilled people like doctors, etc., working out in the rural environments. I mean, we've seen through this pandemic, we've seen remote health, work really well, where people were reluctant to do consultations over a video conference, and now it's become, you know, very effective and very efficient, you know, in terms of use of people's time, etc. So as a result of all of that, you know, there could be a shift, you know, into the rural community, thus increasing the demand profile and making it, you know, more profitable for people to come in and look at the build case.
So yeah, that's very interesting. I think that kind of brings more need for internet and demand in rural areas. Obviously, it also brings a certain high ARPU customers back to the rural communities, and that should slightly change the dynamics of the business plan that they're looking at. One important question that remains is that if regulatory regimes are liberalized, is there enough capital in the market that will actually chase these infrastructure projects? And when I say that enough capital, obviously there is capital, but this kind of infrastructure requires a lot more patient capital, where the financier or the capital provider also needs to take some kind of demand risk. It's not something that you put your money in 3-5 years down the road, it comes back with profit. It's not going to happen. So not only it's going to be long-term patient capital, but it also needs to be slightly more riskier investment, where someone is picking up the demand risk. Do you think there is enough capital in the region that can do? Robert, I'll start with you.
Well, luckily I'm pretty old, so I've seen a lot of it over the last 27 years in the industry. There always seems to be enough capital out there if the opportunity is right. To me, in these emerging markets, in these locations, what we're really looking for, what we're really talking about is, can we get to a low risk opportunity? Can we do a managed risk environment where these international pools of capital are willing to make that investment, are willing to go into these markets and lay down the money? What we're really talking about is traditional telco in these cases, which are really utilities, which aren't going to be we're going to make immense profit in the next 2 years. You know, if you want to make tons of money quickly, you invest in Facebook. You don't invest in fiber or towers in the rural community, but that's a long-term investment that has secondary benefits. So that's what we want to see. And I do believe that the capital is there if the regulatory market opens. What we need to see there is, back to some of my initial points, these regulators in the Vietnams, the Indonesias and such of the world create that 2-tiered structure or 3-tiered structure to create a bifurcated environment, so that there is a type 2 scenario that allows international investment and international ownership, and more importantly, control. The limitations of these markets where, yes, you can invest in a market, but you have to invest with a local provider and they have to maintain control, that will scare away large pools of capital. If you're talking to someone sitting in Wall Street with $1 billion fund, he wants to control his $1 billion. And that's not something I think we're ever going to change. That's just how those markets tend to work. Sorry, long-winded answer to a very simple question. Sorry.
Audrey, what's your take on that? I mean, you're part of Equinix, and there is a lot of investment around building those data centers and connectivity hubs and all that. Do you think there is enough capital that can actually chase the last mile infrastructure as well, putting fiber to the rural communities, connecting the metro cities, even the cities which are currently on the internet still require a lot of upgrade to their infrastructure? Do you think there is enough capital? And do you agree with Robert's assessment that it's primarily regulatory and the control thing that kind of scares those investors away?
I fully agree with what Robert just shared. So different aspects. Firstly, there's definitely enough capital in the market. It's floating around. Investors are just looking for the right opportunities to invest their money in. The right regulatory environment certainly sets the right foundation for these monies to be pumped in. From an Equinix angle, as you mentioned, there is certainly a need for the network edges to go even closer to the end users. So even though we typically operate in a more, there's a bit of feedback. sorry. So there, even though we operate in typically more denser metros, more advanced metros, the uptake in emerging markets certainly is there. I see 5G being one of the trigger technologies in enabling this from happening, simply because firstly, 5G requires denser radio cells. We don't operate the radio network itself. So use cases for 5G include low latency, high throughput, high mobility use cases. And then connecting this 5G network will require you to have a connectivity to a mobile far edge within a 5 millisecond radius of sorts to where the end radio network is going to be. And then you can further backhaul this back to the macro or cloud edge where you can do your data orchestration and cloud connectivity. So if we look at the geography of Asia Pacific, we're not huge. Largely within a 5 and 10 millisecond radius, we can cover a huge part of it already. So with all these emerging technologies coming about, I see the near term that potentially there is a huge amount of demand for data centers to go into these markets in order to support all these calls for being closer to the end users, edge data centers, and it's all primarily supported around whether or not there is a use case for it, there's enough funding for it, and whether the right regulatory environment supports all these from happening.
You're on mute again, mate.
You're on mute again.
Sorry. We also have a question from audience, and I'll start with Adrian on that question. So, what do you think about government-owned or government-sponsored wholesale mobile operator model for widespread mobile broadband deployment? I think what the question is saying that if the government sponsors these NASCOs, network as a service companies, and then all the operators can utilize them, what do you think about that model? And do you have seen that successful somewhere?
Yeah, look, I've seen it happen in Australia with the NBN Co as an example, not necessarily from a mobility perspective, but certainly from a fiber-based perspective, right? And so, and you can apply the same kind of, or at least some of the same characteristics in the mobile world to the fiber-based world, right? I'll talk about 5G in a second, or mobility in a second from a rural perspective, but certainly where you've got a situation where you've got a wholesale provider of connectivity, providing a level playing field, in the wholesale world, and so the wholesalers then are able to differentiate their service by offering a high service, right? And so they're completely differentiated by the service level as opposed to the price level, and how they control the network. Ubaid, you may need to just go on mute. Sorry, thank you. And so so you'll see that service differentiation coming in at that layer, and the price that they all buy at, certainly in Australia is the same, right? So it doesn't matter what your what the volumes you have on your network are. You can control your costs by controlling how you pull the network together in certain elements, but not in all. If I then translate that into a mobile environment, I don't know whether I like the model from a wholesale mobile perspective, but again, the mobile perspective really stops in the densely populated areas, particularly when it comes to 5G, right? Because as Audrey's outlined, the coverage that the small cells have, the density that you need, and the fact that you need fiber connectivity to aggregate the traffic eventually anyway. You might as well deploy the fiber that last couple of 100 meters into the premise rather than deploy a small cell. So I'm not sure that it will go far enough. So that's the difference in my mind between a fiber wholesale deployment versus a mobile wholesale deployment. I don't know that the wholesale mobile deployment will go effectively into the rural areas.
Yep. And if I could just jump on and just follow on with that, government-run organizations, governments are good at writing checks. They're not good at operating networks or data centers or really any infrastructure. I would much rather see an environment in these markets where a government did a partnership with a private company to build out infrastructure in a rural region. So write the check, but with the understanding that it was going to be an open footprint, similar to what you saw in the West, where there might be a local regulated monopoly, but they had to tariff all their rates. So they had to allow open access to anyone who wanted to use their infrastructure at given rates. And if they wanted to sell services in that given market, they would have to sell to a sister company that would actually then have to really buy at those same tariff rates. So create that even playing field. So to take advantage of that check that gets written by the government, they would have to then be a wholesale provider to anyone who came along. I would almost rather see something like that because there's an incentive to be efficient in that model. Whereas if a government runs it, it's just the opposite. There's no incentive to be efficient. There's actually a disincentive because the bigger and more bloated you are, the more jobs, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a very negative fashion. So I would much rather see that sort of model get adopted and used in some of these markets because I think it could be made to work without too much administrative overhead.
I tend to agree to that as well. Having the government funded is really important because there's a lot of money, to be pumped in. But to operate it more openly and freely in the market is equally as important as well. I think Adrian alluded to this a little bit earlier, is that in many, many markets, 4G has just been deployed. LTE is just being deployed. And they've pumped in so much money building up this infrastructure. And now we're talking about 5G. If I put in millions and billions of money into setting up my infrastructure, am I ready to tear it all down just to build up infrastructure just for 5G? If it then becomes a government-supported initiative, it might take that pain away for people to want to adopt it quicker, more than anything else.
Yep, that is true. Yeah. At the end of the day, telcos want to make as much money from their capital investment as possible. They're all for competition as long as it doesn't interfere with their monopoly. So that's sort of how it all works at the end of the day.
So there's an interesting model that recently announced a tender from in Indonesia by Bhakti, which is like a universal access fund under the regulator. And instead of kind of giving out or writing out checks, they're actually inviting the tender for NASCOs, consortiums between mobile operators, infrastructure builders, and suppliers to put together, build a NASCO in those areas, and then the rest of the whole ecosystem will be
just breaking up a little bit.
spaces on a regulated basis. Use those NASCO, right? So, that's an interesting model. Can you guys hear me, Claire? Sorry.
We can hear you now, but you broke up all the way through to, can you hear me now?
Sorry.
You lost your soliloquy.
Yeah, I was just highlighting that in a recent development in Indonesia, Bhakti, which is kind of a universal access fund within the regulator in Indonesia, have announced a tender where they are inviting the bids for an infrastructure development, like a NASCO bid to kind of build 8,000 rural sites. And those rural sites will be on an open access basis. So somebody will build the infrastructure and provide the equipment, and then there will be like a full-blown sharing of spectrum, active sharing. So then all the operators can go out and provide the services and compete. Infrastructure will be like a regulated tariff. So this is an evolving model in the emerging market, and I think everyone is waiting for the success of that model before it's scaled to other countries. Audrey did touch upon, taking the internet closer. So far we were discussing the last mile, which is the biggest challenge at the moment for rural connectivity. But what about the total ecosystem? How closer the internet comes to the consumer? And I think within Asia, there's always been Asia's always been serviced by two connectivity hubs, one in Singapore and one in Hong Kong. The question I have for the panelists is this: is that sustainable considering the demand growth that has come already? And once the new billion people come in, are these two connectivity hubs sufficient to service the whole Asia? If not, then what are the other options? Should it be more disaggregated, kind of going internet right into these countries, peering as low as possible at a lowest possible cost? And what are the emerging Asians or emerging architectures that you look at Asia, Middle East, all the way to Far East?
So
Audrey, I will start with you, and then maybe I can interrupt.
Yeah, go for it, Audrey.
Well, my take on this, the hubs that we're familiar with, Singapore, Hong Kong, we all have our leverage by being global trading and maritime hubs. This is contribution and legacy that's left behind by our forefathers and further developed and supplemented by the governments and their policies thereafter. So we're very well connected in terms of geography. We've got thriving ecosystems, telecommunications, financial services, trading, and that continues to generally be that flywheel to generate overlapping or sub-ecosystems. I'm going to be very politically correct over here, but there are many markets well positioned to be that next generation of hubs. They too have the benefit of good geographical locations, and in some of these markets, there are already positive interest in new submarine cable system deployments. So perhaps with that magic touch from the respective regulators, with global digital leaders leaning into that market, they could very well be on that path to success. I wouldn't name names because on my list would be every other market in APAC, because I think everybody has that potential, right?
Yeah. Well, can I be the non-politically correct person? Is that my job? I think that's where I come.
Change the habit of a lifetime, Robert.
Yes,
Robert, you're wearing that hat.
Well, we work well together, I suppose. Audrey's the smart one, I'm the pretty one, so that's how we sort of break it on up here. So, see, I'm trying to get you in trouble, you bet. I'm really trying. But when I look at it, I'll follow on. To me, there's a number of locations that are, as Audrey said, geographically perfect to become additional hubs, but they lack regulatory issues and they lack rule of law. Why did Singapore and Hong Kong become those hubs? Is it all about geography? No, it's the litany of the history, and it's the fact that foreign investment can come in and have a high degree of assurance that their investment won't be something that disappears or gets nationalized, or unrest creates a high-risk environment. There are models that have been put together over the decades by financial wizards all over the world that govern, where are the risk rewards for certain capital investments. You need to come in where you become something that those models say is viable. Why Singapore? Why not across the border into Malaysia? Or why not Batam in Indonesia? Why hasn't the Philippines come up as a stronger positional location? Why is India now being looked at stronger than certain other areas? Hey, you start to deregulate, you start making it safe for people to invest, and the money will come. There is a pent-up demand for additional hubs in Asia. It's just really a matter, in my opinion, my unofficial opinion, Robert Davidson's opinion, just a matter of who is willing to take advantage of it first. Is it Vietnam? Is it the Philippines? Is it Indonesia? Is it Malaysia? Is it Thailand? There's enough demand out there. There's enough growth out there. Just a matter of who wants it first.
Yeah, I agree also, and I can go a little bit deeper in that, using Audrey's example of the roots of Hong Kong and Singapore, from a maritime perspective in particular. I look at what that translates into today, and for me, looking at subsea capacity today and where subsea capacity lands today as a guide, if you like, for where the next hub should be, right? And so you could look at the Philippines as an example, right? There's a lot of cable system capacity, landing into the Philippines. Is the geographic position of the Philippines the right place for the rest of Asia, so to speak? Maybe not. But if I look at India and look at Chennai in particular, you've got a kind of a trifecta of kind of possibilities there, and that's you've got the subsea cables going in there. Okay, you've got the population in the country immediately, right? Massive population, and a massively underserved population. Okay, so that's a big factor for me as well. And then the guys have talked about the regulatory environment, and I've talked about government in general. If you look at whether there are, you know, investors coming into these markets and spending capital and on a third-party basis in markets, that's guide as well. And I use India again and this is the trifecta, if you like. You know, if I look at what I Squared Capital have done in setting up Lightstorm, Telecom Ventures, and deploying fiber between data centers in particular, you know, not dissimilar to what you know Superloop has done in Hong Kong and Singapore. You know, that is something that we have. That's something that I think will lead to, you know, a decision making and maybe a kind of a lean in on India and maybe even Chennai.
That's really informative. I think we did discuss that there are like larger ecosystem players which are directly into the regulatory or into the, you know, telecom domain, but they have a stake in it and they are already doing it. And I think one of the projects that in Africa is championed by Facebook to Africa that has a potential to kind of open up 22 to 8 to 25 countries in Asia with a subsea landing, and that does you know, change the ecosystem there. It allows the IP transit kind of go lower, better, reliable. That allows and eventually even this start developing opens up market for do you think that there is that like pan-regional opportunity in Asia as well, where like new subsea systems or new chain of data centers, or maybe a terrestrial transit system that can develop and connect different countries together and can bring more reliable, cheaper internet that can further distribute it further along the chain?
Who was that question to? Or I can just take it.
Yeah.
Sure. I love hearing myself talk. Don't worry, there's no problem there.
No, we want a politically non-correct answer this time.
Excellent, excellent. So some of the things you have to keep in mind, at least for Asia, is that the dynamic is very different than Western Europe and North America, where things are very terrestrial and really governed by one regulatory body. So when you're thinking of Asia, you're thinking things are very wet. To get in between countries, you're going subsea, you're going international waters, you're pairing up two very different, very diverse regulatory environments and government systems. So some of the challenges that we see there is that you know, the regulatory environment in Korea looks nothing like Japan, which looks nothing like China. Whereas if you were in Europe and you're talking about, well, the top 20 countries, they all follow pretty much the exact same basic infrastructural model for how they deal with telecommunications. That is not how Asia works at all. So it's very different. It adds an additional layer of complexity everywhere you go and everywhere you want to interconnect. Now, I would love to see an environment where you could create sort of this ubiquitous backbone that connected, you know, picture maybe a fishbone sort of network design that connected all these countries together in a fully shared and open model. The problem, of course, is that whenever you try to get 2 to 3 people to agree to something, it's hard. If you try to get 17 countries in Asia to agree to anything, you know, you try to get them to agree the sky is blue, good luck, that'll take you a few years of conversation. So we do have some of the interpersonal dynamics that would come into play in a lot of these areas that may unfortunately prohibit some of those things from coming into place. I do think we're going to see more levels of collaboration on a regional level as people understand that working together on building out infrastructure in Southeast Asia or Northeast Asia or around the Horn of India are very sensible for multiple people to participate in multiple things. I'm not talking about full consortia, but maybe limited consortia where there is a high degree of control in a shared infrastructure. You know, a good example would be, you know, you build a submarine cable system with 4 fiber pairs, 4 people invest, everyone gets a fiber pair that they control. Sure, you shared the build cost, but you all have individual control. So sort of a middle ground could work very well for Asia, where people still can control what they need to control, but can share where it makes perfect sense. Sorry, again, a long-winded response to probably a very simple question.
Thank you very much, Robert. It was so we have like last 5 to 7 minutes. I just want to to kind of give opportunity to all the panelists to kind of summarize, summarize today's discussion, especially from the barriers point of view and the partnership point of view. So I'll have 2 minutes to each of the panelists to kind of you know give the last punch. What do you think is the barrier and how we can solve the issue? And I'll start with Adrian, and then we'll go with Audrey, and then Robert.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think, there's we covered quite a few topics and quite a lot of ground here. I think the barriers question that you asked at the start kind of set the scene, right? Because we immediately spoke about the barriers that we're seeing in terms of getting to the next billion people. Okay, but immediately we shifted and shifted gear into, well, how do we solve that? Okay, and I really enjoyed the conversation on that basis, because while we agree that there are barriers and some of them are fairly substantial barriers, I think that there are absolutely ways in which we can overcome those barriers. I think that a key thing for me is that there isn't a one size fits all in all of the countries that we're looking to get into here. And I don't think that we've quite landed yet on a model that can in some way be lifted and shifted to more geographies, more environments. And so I'd love to see that a little bit more, and that comes from these types of conversations. It comes from monitoring what's going on in the countries that we're talking about here, the very populous countries and whatnot. And I think that it will happen. I think it needs to happen. I mean, a lot of these rural areas that we're talking about are the breadbaskets of the countries, in some cases neighboring countries. And so, with advancements in technology like IoT, etc., you're going to see way more kind of efficiency being driven in the rural environments, and how the breadbasket is, the food basket is generating their output, and that's critically important for development as well. So thanks to you, Ubaid, and thanks to the panelists.
I'll echo what Adrian mentioned. It's been a very enjoyable session. I think we shared a lot of common views in a lot of topics. But I think for me, one thing that if I was to give one thing to take away, would be, in order to enable better connectivity in general, it's really the community contribution, the partnerships that we can better forge in order to make things, to pave the way. We acknowledge that we live in Asia Pacific. Nothing is going to be easy, but with us coming together, banding together, hopefully things will get better. And if I was to take my Equinix flag right now, as a data center, as a global digital infrastructure company, our key mission is really to enable all the digital providers, players in this world, to harness this global platform that we've built in order to build that global infrastructure that they require. And there's a promise on our part that we will continue to forge better partnerships and continue to build and further deepen our breadth and depth of our ecosystems to enable a more interconnected world.
Fantastic. Robert?
Right. And I'll take my my 2 minutes, and thank you everyone for inviting me. I never get invited to these fun things, so it's nice to be invited for once.
There's a reason for that.
Obviously there is, but from a digital realty perspective, we're really changing. And as you've probably already guessed, I am one of the architects of our regulatory plan and management plan for Asia. So when we see the Asia region, we see many levels of opportunity, even in these tier 2 markets, where if we understand and go in with a full understanding as to what you can and cannot do and how you need to operate, there is a great degree of opportunity to stretch our infrastructure domain into these areas. Over the next year, you're going to see Digital Realty announce 5 new co-location data centers, and you're going to see us moving into some emerging markets. Places where we haven't really existed before, but you're going to see us enter into new. So just because there's a number of barriers of entry to places like Indonesia, hint, hint, and other areas, doesn't mean you can't go in. You just need to go in with eyes wide open and understanding what the playing field is, and the opportunities are there. And we look to be the infrastructure partner for many of the cloud and OTT players in these key markets. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Audrey. I think we all have a common view on what the problems are and what could be the possible solutions. One is the partnership is the key, as Audrey mentioned, and I think uh, the key message is if we work together, it will the results will come in, and I think. We have all have the common mission of connecting and supporting more people to internet. At Facebook, our connectivity, the Facebook Connectivity Initiative has a clear mission of bringing reliable, affordable internet to the masses. For that, we have multiple programs, including the subsea investments. Then we also have an open access transport network. We have done this like tier 2 and tier 3 cities metro built in Indonesia with one of the local wholesalers, which is an open access basis. All the operators can kind of access the dark fiber there so that it makes it more affordable for them to launch services of 4G into the smaller cities and low ARPU markets. And I think the similar initiatives are there from it's a big opportunity. It's also a big challenge putting these people to connect. I think one thing that we and all the governments and all the regulators agree that it's becoming a basic human right to have access to good quality internet, because more and more services, more and more government services and financial services and lifeline services are moving towards internet. I really thank all the panelists and Capacity Media for arranging this panel and giving me opportunity to moderate this. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ubaid. Thank you, Adrian, Audrey, and Robert. We really appreciate all the time that you've put into this session today. I'd once again like to thank all of the sponsors of this event for their support. The next session is beginning in a couple of minutes on APAC's cloud and data center landscape. So please do head over and join that session. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope